Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Eternals, Once and Future, and the upcoming Immortal X-Men. It's Kieron Gillen. Thanks for coming on, Kieron.
Lovely to be here. So I always see my voice drop into radio cadence.
Well, I mean, it's what you got to do. That's if you're in an audio format, you got to sell with what you got. And I mean, you got a good voice for this, I got to say.
I'm not sure. I always think Al Ewing is a good voice. You know, it's like talking to Treebeard. I'm too like Midlands and nasal and too fast. I'm very aware that like if I get even slightly excited, I listen to podcasts sped up. Always. So I can't listen to myself sped up because I'm too quick.
Okay.
When I hear myself, and it's like, yeah. Anyway,
I do think Al Ewing as Treebeard is that is very perfect. But so we're recording this the day after Immortal X-Men was officially announced. So we're recording this on Thursday. It came out on Wednesday. It's interesting. Like, this was, I feel like, an anticipated announcement, because anytime there's new X-Men stuff, it is always anticipated. But I'm interested, what's an announcement day like that like? Is it exciting? Is it kind of old hat at this point because you've been doing it for a while? Like, how was it?
I'm always more surprised by my response to some announcements. Like, some announcement days, I'm like, even some very big issue days, like Die 20 when it came out.
Right.
I was surprised how phlegmatic I was. It's like, oh, right, another, a genuinely personal and major work done. And it's just like, Whilst, yes, I was genuinely quite excited. I was also quite surprised. I mean, I probably shouldn't have been. I mean, I knew it would the first book in a new era after John has left. Yeah, that's a deal. But I was expecting it to be a lot more negative. Honestly, I mean, obviously, and because X-Men are opinionated. That's kind of the classic thing about X-Men readers. They all have their favourites, like X-Men, so none of them can be happy, and that's part of the fun in some ways. So I was expecting it to be more negative, but people have been broadly excited, and I kind of bought into it in that kind of my RSI. The thing that always sets my RSI is refreshing Twitter too much, and my RSI has been set off, so that's pretty much a sign I was engaged. And I really enjoyed like Mark's did this. Mark's did this incredibly conspiracy theory-esque first cover image thing, and people have gone to town and start trying to work out what stuff means. You know, X-Men fans are X-Menning, and that's fun.
See, this is not defaming the nuclear incendiary talent that is Lionel Yu, but he is a great artist. But Mark Brooks is very good at working in those little details that drive people wild. Like, you look through that, combine the fact it's like Last Supper-ish with the fact that you got all these little details, like, why is Cyclops' visor down there? All these little different things. And it is really fascinating to see that. Like, it had everything you wanted out of like an X-Men announcement. It had you returning triumphantly. It had a Mark Brooks teaser blowing people's minds. And it also, I'm pretty sure I didn't realize this, but near as I can tell, people were like dying to have a Quiet Council book. And I guess that is a thing they're getting now.
This is a bit like, everyone presumed Ryan Hughes did the design for the die covers in terms of, the actual hexagon shape, not hexagon, the exploded die shape on the cover. Oh, no, that was a Stephanie idea. And it was so funny that, Stephanie is such an un-Ryan-like thinker, but she still did that, and then Ryan built upon it. In the same way, like, I'm sure that my pretentious nonsense, people would presume that, oh yeah, Last Supper, let's go lead into religious imagery, make it. No, Mark came in and said, let's do this, and I was kind of like, are you sure? It's like incendiary amounts of work.
Yeah.
And Mark said, no, let's do it. And so Mark had a bunch of ideas, then I did a bunch of other ideas. So I went, okay, this is the seating order, this person is this person for that reason. Here are other elements you can add. This can be this can tease this other thing later, and then use as much or as little as you want. And he used everything, obviously.
Yeah,
Mark. It's like wonderful, devotional, and it's one of these things that you sort of know that if you put the work into it, like, people will take it apart. That's kind of like, that's one of the things. The more I've gone into comics, the more you kind of build the readership you want. And you can't always control it entirely, and it certainly doesn't work like that. But by doing the thing, you encourage the thing.
Yeah.
And you've got to. There's a leap of faith, and it's really good to be caught.
Do you feel like you've built the readership you want at this point? Because I feel like there's obviously the Gillen McKelvey people, but I also feel like there's the people who just kind of know and trust that, if you're going to do Die, or if you're going to do Ludocrats, or if you're going to do Once and Future, they're all going to be kind of different sides of what interests you, and they trust in you. Like, is that something that you feel like you've cultivated over the years?
Like, I mean, I forget who actually said it, but your flaws are your style.
Sure.
And I'm like, and it's one of those awful things. I mean, I remember like trying to bend this on a Marvel Summit probably about a decade ago, like circa when I was on Uncanny X-Men, and it's the moment when you realize, oh no, you've been around forever. You're now the establishment. And there's definitely that kind of like, and the other part of you is aware that, 15 years ago you were sleeping on hotel floors at cons, but you're not that guy anymore, and you're in a very different sort of place. And I think the thing that occasionally breaks creators is when they don't realize they've made that move. So I mentioned that conversation with Brian because it was like kind of Brian talking about the strangeness of that. Oh, I remember, being a different sort of creator, but now you realize you're not. So I'm definitely conscious of how to phrase this one. I am who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as much as I wish my flaws weren't there, I'm also aware that my flaws are interesting enough to people to support a readership.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, and I've always leaned into do the work that only you can do. I mean, and especially because the work I've most loved in like mainstream comics is kind of not just someone trying to do a good X-Men book. It's Grant Morrison doing an X-Men book, or Claremont doing an X-Men book. Because it's like, let's do the thing in the way that you see it. And I'm following that kind of thinking. That's what I've always tried to do. Like, okay, how would I do this book? And the answer can differ quite a bit. And you do it enough, and people realize they're going to hate you or not. And occasionally, it's. I mean, sitting here playing with a dice, and you're aware there are angles to you, and you're always trying to look for what's a new angle, the way that I would see this. Like, what's a bit of myself which I haven't really explored, even though it's still yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like Once the Future. I was thinking at the start, after I had the core idea, which is like Arthur as the mummy in the, that's the core idea is like, let's just, how can you do a decolonize the mummy? And what you do is you use the British myths as the thing which is the supernatural threat, rather than turning other cultures' cultural mythic forefathers into monsters. And then it was, okay, who's going to be facing them? And the figure was, okay, I've never written about my relationship with my gran. I've never written that kind of like 2-generational skip thing. That will be interesting. So that's kind of all. So like, What's the Future simultaneously very, very me, but also like, oh, they haven't seen that bit before. Like Bridget is, you can see it's like Sersi or Emma Frost or Emily Aston photograph. These are all sorts of a certain type of like aspect of a woman there.
Mm-hmm.
And then like Bridget's another one. Like, let's take her forward 40 years and see what she's like then. Okay, it all kind of comes back to a bastardized quote from Ballard, which me and Jim Rosenall, my long-standing friend and partner, who games journalist back in the day, we did Ludocrats together a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And Ballard didn't quite say this, but we simplified it down. And it's stay true to your obsessions, and your obsessions will be true to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of one of the things which me and him, for that matter, have always kind of followed. Like, it's always, why do I care about this? And you kind of hope that if you care about something intensely enough, someone else will agree with you. And scene.
I do want to say this is, so you have a very excellent way to describe Once and Future. I have a very simplified version way to describe it. And you might think this is terribly wrong, but I feel like it's all of the things you said, but it's also like, what if Kieron Gillen did like a 1980s action movie? It's got, I mean, like, that's one of the things I think is really interesting about Once and Future is it has a lot of complexity to it. I don't want to oversimplify it. The relationships are really important. There's a lot of very fascinating stuff happening with like nationalism and like populism and everything like that. But at the same time, it's really, really fun, like pure fun in a way that I'm not saying you're not capable of, but maybe you don't lean into to the same degree.
I would agree entirely. Honestly, I would say it's as dumb as balls. Honestly, I think I said this in a newsletter recently. It's the smartest dumb book on the market, or possibly the dumbest smart book. I don't know which. Absolutely, this is kind of when I was thinking up What's the Future. Like, it was partially the Boom wrote to me saying, "Hey, do you want to do a book? Dan Morrow will be, he'll be interested in working with you. Would you be interested in working with him?" And sort of me just sitting and thinking, okay, what would I want to see Dan Morrow draw?
Yeah.
Also, the flip was, I have a very masochistic, like Catholic approach to my art, as in I don't believe that art is art suffering. Is one of those sort of questions. No, not. But there's definitely some degree that my create our own stuff at Image is hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And Once the Future was kind of born of the idea, why don't I just try to write a book a bit like Afra?
Mm-hmm.
Like something which is easy for me to do. And easy is a word I hate because I think everything should be hard. And the idea that something can be fun for me, it seems blasphemous. But no, Once and Future is absolutely fun. It's this kind of, okay, it's got a lot of ideas in, it's about culture and art, but it's also kind of tickling that same pop thrill of, okay, here's X Arthur character, let's see what Dan and Tamara do to him this month. And then every issue is like, okay, what new mad stuff, what's new berserk stuff can I get Tamara and Dan to do? You know, and that's, you can sort of sit there and sort of a little scratch. And like, I remember it's like the current arc, I was thinking I wanted to take it down a gear, and I do to begin with. And it's okay, let's do it. So almost like Walking Dead, not quite as hard as Walking Dead, but like, okay, post-apocalyptic in other world, and make it a bit more survivalist. And writing issue 25, and there's a sequence that's so ludicrous. I kind of stop the script and write. At this point, our attempt to become more grounded may have failed. But yeah, honestly, the idea, because this is the thing I love about comics instead of being a novelist. With a novelist, you're mainly working on one thing at once. With a comic, you get to change it up. So I couldn't do 4 books like Phonogram at month, or 4 books like Die, but I could do like Once and Future and Die and Eternals and Immortal. You know, like they scratch significantly different places. That it's a bit like being refreshed in the same way. You know what I mean? Like you get to return to an earlier question. You get to show different fragments of yourself.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely like. I mean, Once and Future is really fun. I feel guilty about it. It's so much fun. This should be more hard work than this.
I do want to say, for a person who hates easy, I feel like easy can be hard for you, maybe. Like, maybe it's just like you're having to push yourself in a direction you're not comfortable with, where it comes very naturally. And, like, that's hard in its own way.
It's hard because I'm by nature, I'm a silly person. You know, you'll hang out with me in person, and it's like, it's goofy, and then you see me change gear when suddenly like the philosophy comes out. You know, and that's, I think you can see that in the work quite often. In that kind of, you know, a book like Young Avengers, where we deliberately were trolling with the style over substance title, in that, oh yeah, we're going to do this glacial, this very shiny surface, and then there's so much stuff beneath it. Yeah. And it's meant to, you know what I mean? Like, and it's going to be the surface is going to be so shiny you won't be able to. Some people are just going to bounce off it like it's a mirror.
I did want to, like, this is a thing that I wanted to bring up, because like Once and Future does feel way different than Eternals, which felt like way different than Die. And you can go through your entire career and you can just see that. Even if you're the constant, but it's like you're saying, it's like the different fragments, the different sides of you. Is that partially because, like, trying dramatically different flavors of stories for yourself, is that partially to represent different sides of you, or is it just like not wanting to have too much of one flavor at one time?
It's partially boredom. I think, honestly, like, boredom is a really good one in terms of, okay, I've done that, why would I do it again?
Right.
Alan Moore, you know, just talk, what, you know, the second you've kind of, people get an idea what you could do, maybe you should do something else. And most of it, I don't think I've been that successful at that. Like, you can still sort of see it's me, but at the same time, just hopefully not repeating myself, was also clearly repeating myself. That's one of my favorite sort of. I've definitely been doing it long enough that people have picked up. Wait a sec, he's got themes. And you know, oh no, it's Kieron doing a story about like how stories hurt us again. And that was another part of Once and Future, is that, you know, the point of Wickdiv was it builds towards the reveal that these people have been bewitched by stories they want to believe in, but ultimately harmful for them. And like with Once and Future, I started with that in terms of, like, from the off, stories are evil. They all want to kill us. And to be honest, Once and Future goes for, you know, as many of my books are much more like positive about stories as well. Like, they show the up and the downside. Once and Future just goes, let's assume that the story wants to kill us and see where it goes. Let's do the worst possible portrait. And that's part of it, isn't kind of like, because I think individual works have ironies, but they can also make different statements about things. So like, I kind of hope that people see that Die says something slightly different from says in quotation marks. But yeah, so partially boredom, partially it's just, okay, what is this story, and then what tools can I bring to bear? And sometimes it's like, okay, I'm interested in trying something with more captions or less captions, or I found it really interesting to watch, say, Rick's I've got the name of Rick's current book,
the Righteous Thirst for Vengeance.
Righteous Thirst for Vengeance. But seeing Rick, to put no finer point to it, shut the fuck up. And it's a joy because he's clearly like he's an expert in the kind of Miller-esque, very short captions, evocative captions like pictures. He's really good at that. But he's kind of gone, no, let's give space here. And he sort of stepped back and he's done a very clean line and it works beautifully. And it's both leaves space for the artist, but also gives it a very different kind of mood. And that's kind of what I'm always thinking of. Okay, what techniques are interesting, and also, of course, what techniques suit this artist. It's that kind of like when I finished Wictive, I realized I wanted to do something aesthetically very different from Wictive, and like working with Stephanie after Jamie, there's no way Die could be like Wictive, because if I wrote the scripts I wrote for Jamie, they just wouldn't happen.
Right.
I joke, it's like I did a grid in issue 1 once, and it came back like these diagonal slashes across the page, and I just realized, oh yeah, doesn't matter. It's one of those situations where it's like I describe collaborating with Stephanie like the ocean all the time, but it's that kind of, you can be a bit King Canute in this kind of, imagine King Canute standing before the ocean going grids. And that's, of course, that's what that collaboration is about. And that's for me, it's one of the things that keeps you in comics, that, okay, who is this person? How can we get on together? How can we make something, like with Eternals, for example, you're thinking, okay, what do I want from Esad? For me, I'm an Esad fan. Like, he's genuinely I don't want to say favorite because I don't really believe in the concept, but he's like in terms of creating fantasy worlds on the page, he does something which I find incredibly delicate and beautiful. And he does things with scale. And for me, like, my favorite Esad panels are the ones where you have this incredibly deep focus. And you get I always think that one in the first 4 arc, when you've got the giant in the far background and someone close up. And so all the way through Eternals, I'm thinking, okay, when can I give Esad a big shot? You know?
Yeah.
And that'll give us because this is the book I want to feel simultaneously epic and a bit quirky. That's part of my thing. I'm really going scattershot this one. You can tell I haven't spoke to people very much this year, David. You know what I mean? But like that kind of like, okay, Esad's epic, but how can I make it feel somewhat different? So I get this mixture between being, oh yeah, this is absolutely straight-faced, epic, it's ludicrous scale work, and at the same time, it's got the quirky elements of like the narrator. You know, like I'm always, there's a sense of playfulness there, and at least part of Eternals. I mean, if you step all the way back, like, I wanted Eternals to not feel like any other book on the market. Yes. And that's one of those cool things. I suspect we can talk about a lot about, in fact, your incredible article about what makes the Eternals work. Thank you very much. But one of the things was all the way through is, how can I make this book have its own niche? And part of that niche was, it can't just feel like 4. Because, if I'm going to, I wanted to use I thought captions might be useful for scale and give information, because I wanted a very dense book. But also I kind of realized, I was thought about third person narrator. And I'm like, no, that just makes it turns into 4. Then it becomes like, okay, third person narrator with a more distinct voice. And then that rapidly leads to, oh no, embed them in the narrative. And then you've got the planet Earth. And that's like, oh, that's interesting. And then the planet Earth is sick. And you can do some really sort of warped, meandering, almost cat's cradle. There's something weirdly broken Vonnegut, I think, about also Hitchhikers as well. And it, and that suddenly creates the book's voice in that kind of like, and that either turns people on or turns people off, but it's certainly its own thing.
I do want to say, like, you mentioned, like, you were trying to do something that felt different than everything else. Honestly, like, that's one of the things that really astonished me about Eternals is, like, there's a number of things that separate it from any Marvel book, from any Kieron Gillen book in some ways, any Esad Ribic book. Matt Wilson's still Matt Wilson, even though he has the unusual challenge of trying to color Esad, which I imagine is very challenging. Well, just because Esad's a painter, he thinks in color. I'm stressed for Matt from a distance, but one thing I really like that you do in the book, I think that Esad has always been very underrated at comedic timing because he's such a good character actor. And I think that you accentuate, you're very good at dealing with the scale, but I think you're good at accentuating strengths of Esad that don't get accentuated very often. And I really like that. I actually made a comparison once in an article that I said that there's like Arrested Development energy to Eternals at times, which like when somebody was like a sitcom, and I'm like, read it. There's something there. But anyways, but then there's other things, like I mentioned this in my review where I said that like you took the machine's narration and you integrated the mechanic of editor's notes into the actual narration. And like, that doesn't sound that crazy. But anytime I can say I've literally never seen this in a Marvel comic before is a very unusual thing, because famously they've been around for a very long time. And then also, like, I really like the data pages. Obviously you're working off some of like the, I don't know if that's like a working off of the X-Men energy, but there's some of that playing with death, figuring out what death means for Eternals. Like, that's a huge thing. And I also love the one shots in between arcs, like, and how like that gives Esad a rest, but also can build up the universe. I don't know. I mean, like, does this feel like, it feels like you kind of have a sandbox to be experimental within Marvel, which is kind of unusual. Like, a lot of times they're not considered experimental as a publisher. Is that kind of where you're working from?
I'm simultaneously a writer who likes being, I wouldn't say actually, I'm a demystifying writer. I try to basically tear the curtain away, say, this is what Oz is. And it's kind of like, no, when you hire a writer and put in a position like this, it's like they want you to create something interesting for them. Because interesting thing, you increase the value of the IP for the corporate owner.
Right.
And that's why they bring you in. And like, and especially like, I think John, I mean, obviously John was never quite all the way from Marvel, but when John took over the X, it's this kind of, I was very aware of him bringing back stuff he picked up on Black Monday Murders specifically. Like, and part of me, seeing him have so much fun, that it was like, that's good. If I came back and did some stuff at Marvel, what skills would I take from Wictive and Dye and Ludacris even, and apply them to Marvel? And that's kind of like what Eternals is for me. As in, yeah, it absolutely is picking up the space that John has created. That John has basically worked out a way to make Marvel like get a designer to do data pages. It's like, yes, at last.
Yeah.
I mean, John, this is one of the things like, I would never say that John is not the person who's most known for doing this. But if you look at my indie work, there's like all manner of like stuff that could be read as data pages. There's an interest in tech, like Wictive uses them. We did a whole issue of Phonogram. Like, actually, I'm lying. About half an issue of Phonogram was fanzine cut out pages and stuff like that. I'm always been very interested in the alternate uses of text to compress or get more value. This is one of the things about Black Monday Murders was part of the, I believe it was John's idea, as in issues can be different sized. Like the line I always use to describe John is John sees the cage, or no, rather John is interested in the cage. Like, and I think that's something to some degree we share. I think John's much more devoted to, because I think the limits in how we think and what we do is John's theme. And John is somebody who looks at, why a 20-page comic? Why are comics the same size every issue? Why can't we have this? And like, that's, why not? And there's something really joyful or mischievous. And occasionally, like when I started joining, when I was in the X office and starting to see the internal office dynamics, this part of me does think about John as, depends what day it is. It's either Magneto or Xavier, in terms of like, there is a dream and a vision of a world, and I'm going to teach you how to do it, and I'm going to create space for you to express yourselves. Because this is kind of like, this is what John did different on X than I did on Eternals. Is X was clearly he's not brought in to just have a vision and a setup. Here, create a space to play. As in, I find, this is an interesting setting to do work in. Whilst Eternals is much more, let's do a single really good book, which is interesting and creates a bunch of new stuff that people could just buy in to. And this is so it's much more, I've turned to the word hermity. Like Eternals is literally, hey Kieron, you've come back from the wilderness. Now we're going to lock you in a cage. Just see what we can do with it. And like, for me, I was also built on the idea, if I was going to come back to Marvel, I wanted to come back hard. So like when I'm talking about, using the skill set I brought, so the enormous research and world building stuff that Dye and Wictive are based upon, let's do that with, also what I learned from the research around Dye and Wictive, let's try that with the Eternals. And for me, it was like, I've used this line before, but turning continuity into mythology. So looking at everything that the Eternals had done and think, okay, why? Let's pretend this was all made up as one cloth. Let's assume that all these people who were working for different ends at different times had a master plan. And if we step back, what do we see? And for me, it's stuff like, Thanos is much more important to the Eternals than you would have thought. And it's suddenly like, Thanos is absolutely at the heart of the schism in Eternal society. And all this stuff is historically there. But when I was writing this enormous Bible document thing, I was not in fact, I'm still not sure what I'm going to use. And that's the joy of it. In that kind of, I was deliberately, one of the techniques like both Dye and Wictive uses is the world is much bigger than the book. And and there's stuff I know that sprawls past the edge of the page, and by implication, people know stuff's out there. And there's a real power to being in the hands of a creator who knows more than you do. And I don't mean that in a wanky way. I mean that much more as a kind of like, oh, this world is more solid.
Yeah.
And world building's got a kind of dirty rep in science fiction in quite a few recent years. Like there's waves of pushback against it, because I suppose I kind of agree with it. Making stuff on the fly and yes-anding works really well. I mean, What's the Future has some really hard rules to it, but it's very yes-anding in that kind of like, I've got a lot of material to use and then I arrange it. But Eternals is much more, okay, let's got this million-year history. Let's work at, these are the big wars. This was the big religious issues. These are the matters of philosophy between Uranus and Kronos. This is what Kronos was doing when he ascended. All that kind of stuff. Am I going to do those stories? I have no idea. But, I know them, and that makes it really fun to allude to quietly. So when we get to do them, it's great, because, like, Uranus has been kind of mentioned almost all the way along. And it's like, oh, we get to an issue. Let's drop in a Uranus. Let's show this guy.
Yeah.
And then, of course, talking about lifting techniques, that's exactly what we did on Wictive.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we use these specials to A, bring in a different artist appropriate to the work, but B, give the main artist more time to work, and also expand the scale of the world. Basically it's fun. And this is what I mean, like, you're both inspired by your peers, because, as you said, there's absolutely X is a powerful influence on Eternals in terms of, like, what is possible. I mean, but it's also like bringing the skills you got back and then kind of synthesizing it into something else and showing what maybe you can do with it and have fun.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I wanted to add, one of the brilliant things I think John did was just take death off the table.
Yeah.
In that kind of like, okay, superhero comics, the reader is somewhat bored of the concept of death. Let us, as a source of drama, they know heroes mostly come back in the Marvel Universe. Well, let's remove that and then see what happens. You know what I mean? And then suddenly stories are tense for different reasons. And like what I did with Eternals, and you can see why that might lead to part of the thinking on my Eternals, is like,
it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. I'd like it, they're eternal. Let's give a completely different reason why death is interesting.
Yeah.
Like we know the heroes are going to come back. Let's put different stakes on the table. Yeah. And that was kind of like, as well as the Eternals' fundamental flaw as human beings, also it's any Eternal who is good has a Peter Parker aspect, as in, I can't fail, I can't die, because it's for someone else. Because, sacrifice is a heroic act. And I tell you what, there's a theme in my work of putting the concept of heroism and sacrifice under the microscope. Because that's me absolutely tearing apart my Catholicism.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker, Lisa K. Weber's Hex 11, which has been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse 2, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show. And it's really fascinating, though, because, like, you look at Icarus. It's funny, like, I feel like Icarus as an arrow has become, like, this very quintessential phrase for the character already. Like, somebody messaged me after I, like, wrote about the Eternals movie, and they're like, I was really hoping to hear Icarus as an arrow in there. And I'm just like, I mean, that would have been wild, but at the same time, it is such a perfect phrase for him. But it is fascinating because, like, very mild spoiler alert for I'm not going to spoil it. In the first Eternals arc, Icarus makes a decision that is a potentially world-saving decision where he doesn't even have to put any thought into it, because he just does it. He just goes into it because he knows what's going to happen afterwards, which is he's going to come back to life and he'll be fine. And it's interesting because Icarus is a character who fundamentally does not have doubts because of the way his life is structured. And the way that you change things introduces doubt into an arrow, which is a fascinating thing, because what are arrows famous for? Not changing direction. And I don't know. I mean, I love that part about it. I do want to. So this is not me casting aspersions about previous Eternals runs, but one thing I think is fascinating is like I really like Neil Gaiman and John Romita Jr.'s run, but from my memory, I could be mistaken because it's been a long time since I read it. What I remember about that Eternals run is it was focused on kind of making things smaller and making things like to a certain degree. I mean, it was a big story, but it was also like there was like a mystery and a personal element to it. But one of the things I really like about yours is it makes everything bigger, and it, like expansive in the universe. Like you even like worked the is it the 1 million BC Avengers into Celestia? Yeah, it's like things like that, and you're working it in. It's like it's not deliberate connection to continuity. It's just like this is where they would have been back then. And like it's part of the story because that's the way that things are. It kind of reminds me, and I'm not like Al's been doing this less long than you, so it's not like he introduced the idea of how to use continuity, but it reminds me of how Al uses continuity in a way that it's just like it's color. It's not necessarily defining the act of it, and I think that's really interesting because it makes Eternals feel as big as the idea I think is meant to be, if that makes sense.
I'm very complimented by the comparison to Al. I think Al is a poet of continuity, and its continuity is, Al is. I think I said this in public a while ago, but I don't think there's anyone working in mainstream superhero comics whose work I more read and more regularly think this bears the touch of an artist.
Right.
And like there's bits where it's like, oh wow, this is genuinely something elevated above mere good. I'm not naming mere good's everything, but like there's something, even when I don't always like something, it's like I think that's art. Right. And of course I love Al. He's one of my favorite writers. I think I'm a little sluttier than Al is. I think Al is quite devotional about the concept of continuity and how the Marvel universe works. I think I have more cheat in me, but at the same time, using it as using what happened as a story prompt, I'm very into. It's that kind of like, that's a lot when I say turning continuity into mythology. That's partially that, as in let's assume all this was planned.
Yeah.
And so the 1,000 million BC Avengers, like, well, you just look at the timeline. Like the Celestials arrive, they fight the Avengers of 1 million BC, and then they leave. But when they arrive, they also create the Eternals. We know that because that's when the Eternals arrived. So they would have been the first people. They would have been around. They would have met. What would they think of each other? I bet they wouldn't have got on.
Yeah.
That's the yes and of it, and then kind of we just weave it together. It's definitely like it's tricky because for me the Marvel universe, where I think it differs to some degree the DC universe, it's the world outside your window of it. With Eternals, is simultaneously you want to make it big because the idea they were eternal, they have lived for 1 million years, making that feel real is important for me because like that's why, and it's not even just Marvel history. I'm quite aggressively putting it in real history as well. That's kind of I'm interested in time. You want remember you compared Sersi to Tahani from The Good Place. You want the Sersi name drop, Sersi name dropping, and all these kind of tropes you want there, and that kind of grounds them in one way if you put them in real history. But the other way is like any issue, and to us there's a few of them. Which doesn't have something that's clearly set on Earth bothers me. The context, the frame matters. And that's one why Toby and the family is so important in that first arc. Because you get so much, there's a lot of great you talk about the Arrested Development of it, but like you get so much great comedy by putting immortal beings who do not think like us in the context of someone trying to make breakfast for their kid. You know what I mean?
That entire Robson family scene is like an incredible scene. Like the combination of just the fact that Icarus is like drinking coffee and is very complimentary of it, and the Silver Surfer joke is just beautiful.
I do. Actually, I'm pleased. I mean, thank you for that. It's a scene I'm very pleased with. I'll tell you what, here's a scene. I never watched Arrested Development until lockdown this year. Actually last year rather. As in like, it was a weird hole in my TV watching. And when I watched it, I was like, oh, I understand certain things better now. You know what I mean? It's like one of those, because I came to like the US office quite late. And then it was, oh, right, I can see the hole in the chronology. But like, it's Arrested Development. Has anyone talked to Matt and Chip about Arrested Development's influence on sex criminals?
I don't think so. I can see it though.
I could, it's one of those things that struck me, and like, I should probably I'm friends with them. I can talk to them. But like, but I can definitely like see Arrested Development. And actually, I think I wrote all the Eternal stuff before I watched Arrested Development as well,
Yeah.
which is nice. And so it's like Immortal, actually Eternals. When I made up Uranus, is before I watched any Succession.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there's a lot of Roy energy in Uranus, as
Oh my
in, you know,
God.
the patriarch of the family, perpetually disappointing their useless children. And honestly, it's so much. It's like, oh my God, this is perfect. This is literally. I now how to. I now know how to describe this guy.
That's amazing.
I mean, there's some Succession in the Immortal as well, in some ways.
Well, okay, so I do want to talk about the Eternals are fascinating. So, like, here's a fun fact for you. When issue number 8 hits next week, you'll officially have written the Eternals run with the third most issues ever. By the time the second arc ends, you'll be at number 2. Eternals have, I feel like they've always had like kind of a tough time connecting with Marvel readers, and it's interesting because, you know, like there have been amazing people who've worked on them. I mentioned Gaiman Romita Jr. Like, you know, it started with Jack Kirby, et cetera, et cetera. Even like you look at the letters columns for the original Jack Kirby run, people are like, "What the hell is this?" And it's fascinating. But I'm not saying these characters are disliked, but I do feel like to a degree, your first volume was tearing them down to rebuild the idea of the Eternals with some of like the rough edges sanded down. When you jumped onto this, did you feel like there was like, did you have to have almost like a problem solving approach when you first started on this book, or is that an oversimplification of it?
Not really. I mean, I would say problem solving is part of, as in like, it's okay. Why? One of the first questions, right, is why didn't they work?
Right.
Like, or why? Or rather, how have they? To us, there's bits that the Eternals have worked very well. I mean, the Celestials are work incredibly well, but they work so well they're no longer owned by the Eternals. You know what I mean? It's a bit like, imagine like if Dr. Octopus was so successful, Spider-Man couldn't use him, or you know, or rather like couldn't use him and own him.
Right.
And so like a lot of the Eternals' best stuff has been kind of like taken for parts from them. You know. And the Celestials, my God, they're a great idea. They do as a visual, I mean, as a single Kirby-esque visual, they're like ludicrous. I love them so much.
Talk about scale. I mean, it's just like, like Esad working on it. Woo.
I tell you, that's one of the things I love. As in, obviously, Esad is not the same sort of artist that Jacket was. Sorry, Kirby. I'm not going to first name him. I never met him. Like, it wasn't the same artist Kirby was, but like, there was definitely an element in Eternals. I want to, as much as we're being reconstructive and changing so much stuff, I wanted to be absolutely in the same emotional spirit as Kirby in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, it's through my own prism rather, but like very much coming from what did I think Eternals was going to do?
Right.
Because the thing about Eternals, the most striking with that early Kirby stuff is it's unfinished. In fact, like even like when you look at the Fourth World sort of stuff, I feel more he was further into the Fourth World story than he was the Eternals. Because the Eternals, all the way to the end, he's introducing new characters, setting new stuff up. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in some ways, you know, you mentioned the bigger and biggerness of what we're doing in Eternals. It's a bit like that.
Mm-hmm.
Into like, and especially like, one of the things I'm most striking about Eternals is he is already, even like a few issues in, he is questioning the setup. Like the idea that, you know, we've got these higher species, these lower species, and where's that? This is deeply problematic.
Right.
Like it's a guy who fought in World War II, you know. So like the questions over, like, so me not lowering the Eternals, but moving the how, as in the Eternals' strengths, also their weaknesses. They are, you know, them being eternal is limitation,
right?
And frankly, a petrifying limitation. That kind of stuff, and there's more about the deviants in the second arc, but like. You see, like Kirby by introducing people like Carcass, the deviant with the soul of this poet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's absolutely okay. What is a deviant? What is deviancy? I mean, there was part you just say, okay, why haven't they worked? And to us, you do that with every book in terms of like, how can you polish something up? Like what? How can you make it better? Because you don't want to make it worse. You know,
right?
And to us, if it's a case of if it isn't broke, I don't know. There's always some fixing. As in, what bothers you about this? And for me, it was like. I imagine if it's ever an omnibus, they might print my initial pitch rather than this is my plans for it. And I got, you know, you talk about the big discovery in issue 6, that I put that in the original pitch, and I was pretty sure they would have said no to it. It seemed to be like, this is so brutal,
yeah,
you know, and this is so like hard. They're going to be, you know, and they were always like, that's a really good idea. In fact, it's You know what I mean? It's a strikingly, oh, we get it, and that's why it works. But it was explicitly, so I sat down and, to be honest, like I read your article, as I said, a lot of your thinking was kind of my thinking in terms of like the Eternals. In some, they were written to stand alone. You know, they don't sit with the Marvel universe, in a universe where gods exist. Like people who were once mistaken for gods are just less interesting. So I kind of, okay, let's make them angels. You know, equivalent, like here's a niche that, and if you look at Celestials are gods, Eternals are the things, you know, like they are actually angels, and angels are an interesting niche which are not filled in the Marvel universe. That was the key thing. You look for places where they're not doing someone else's job. But the word eternal was interesting. You know, okay, how are they different than gods, and the idea of the unchangingness. Sorry, because that's one of the things about angels in certain bits of theology is, you know, these are immortal beings outside time and space and unchangeable. You know, and angels don't have free will. You know, that's petrifying. You know, free will is one of the things that obsess me. So that's petrifying and interesting. So, you know, you dig into that. Okay, that makes them different. And this is one of the things that so you start looking at how you can make them different, what you can make weird into assets by leaning into it. Because I think there's good stuff in all of the Eternals stuff that's ever come out. Yeah, and I definitely, you can tell because I've used them. But at the same time, I think sometimes people have been leaning away from the weird because they're thinking that's a way to like marvelize them a little. And I haven't. I've gone, no, let's push into the weird of them, but keep them in the context of more normal stuff around them, and see how they. There's that aspect to it because the core of it, and is the issue 6 twist, as in being a hero in the Marvel universe is always a curse. Like the heroes of feats of clay is the way that people mostly say about it. My way of looking is, in the DC universe, the main heroes are paragons in a fallen world. The world is the problem. You know, like Batman's parents were killed. Now he becomes a bat and stops crime. Batman never did anything wrong. Wonder Woman is someone from a higher realm sent to save us all and bring peace and love. Wonder Woman never did anything wrong. Conversely, Spider-Man became a wrestler, let a criminal get away and got his uncle killed. Yeah. He guiltily blames himself. Spider-Man is a fallen person in a fallen world trying to be better and recover for their sins or failings. Like all the Marvel characters have that, as in I'm a problem and the world's a problem too, and we have to try to get through it. And speaking philosophically, I'm close to that. You know, I'm somebody who believes humans have to strive to be as best as they can. Right. And I think that to turn towards the future, the idea that heroes are flawless is a story we've told ourselves that is ultimately delusional. You know what I mean? Humans are humans, and we can just strive to be heroes. An idea, you can never be an idea. I'm going off one now. Anyway, I love it. The Eternals aren't, so they didn't have anything. It was pretty great to be an Eternal, apart from, you know, people dying because, you know, you're immortal and they're not. But, you know, but the gods have that too. So that's not even unique to the Eternals. So it's like, let's give them an Uncle Ben. I think that's the line I said. I think we need an Uncle Ben.
That is a perfect line. Oh my God. Sorry. You staggered me with that one. That one's amazing.
Also, I use Uncle Ben as my go-to metaphor all the time for everything because it's such a wonderful, clear piece of writing. It's like, you know, Uncle Ben, well, you know, and I kind of use that as a prism to look at heroes of all kinds, as in what's their Uncle Ben? What won't go away? And why do they do it?
You know, I do think one character who's really fascinating in this, just one more thing after this on Eternals before we move on, but I think Sersi is so fascinating because, like, Sersi, it's interesting. She was an Avenger. She was all these different things. But at the same time, there's the scene in the first arc where she's dealing with Tony Stark. And basically, like she loves humans, but she also values them in a completely different way than everyone else. And because of her eternal nature. And it's really interesting seeing how you use these different characters in different ways that fits with who they are, but also slightly changes them given what we learned about how the Unimind is used, and also in how, like, the twist in number 6 about how their deaths affect humanity. And it's interesting because, like, if I remember correctly, Sersi knew, right?
Yeah, Sersi knew.
Yeah, so Sersi, like, it's interesting because that's one of those moments where it's like, I don't think it's a real, like, point of emphasis, But that fundamentally changes the character in such a fascinating way. She, in some ways, like, even though she isn't like the forefront like Icarus or even Thanos, she has changed as much as anybody because of what we learn about her.
Yeah, it's all like Sersi. It's hard to say who the heart of my run is, but I think Sersi is in many ways the lead character like that because she's troubled. It's one of those like I disliked having to have Icarus as my lead in the first arc. When I say that, I mean he's the white straight dude.
Yeah.
Like, and that's not ideally what I want. But of all the Eternals, he's the only one who could fit that role.
Right.
Because he, like, I couldn't have Sersi as the lead because it doesn't fit Sersi. It wouldn't be as damaging and hurt. So who's the worst person who could discover this?
He's the biggest contrast. He's the one who like is most harmed by the turn.
Yeah. But like Sersi, I think intellectually is like, she's kind of the leader of my Eternals.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and she's troubled because she knew about it. And it's definitely like, I think it speaks to my kind of perspective on people. Sersi is quite regularly presented as the kind of dilettante. She's a good time girl, to quote myself in issue 6. And like, it sort of speaks to the Wick Div or even the phonogram that like people who are like that, I tend to have. There's more darker notes there, Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, she's incredibly carefree around the humans because she knows they're going to be dead. Yeah. And this is these mayfly people, these mayfly pleasures,
right? And
like there's something really, and the fact that I'm digging into her in that way means that the sadness is there. She also, I think she's going through a depressed time as well.
Absolutely.
That's kind of like I think she's just down. And this is what like she actually also says she's going along with them this time and trying to protect them. That's not something she has done before. Like when they found out, she's deliberately let it go. That's why she still remembers.
Right. And
it's like that kind of, well, she's desperately bored. She wants out as well. This kind of, but she's somebody who isn't quite committed. And that leads to the question is, why was she able to make this commitment? Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, on some level, is she just less good a person? What's that? And can she change that? What's that even mean?
Well, and she's the one who has the weight of memory, which makes her very interesting, too. But before we move on from the Eternals, I have to bring up the actual main character. Jack Mulqueen asked, a patron of the podcast, he asked, the narrative voice in Eternals, the machine, has such a colloquial Gen Z voice. It's almost jarring in contrast to the Eternals' melodramatic Shakespearean dialects. How did you devise such a delicate balance between these two voices, and why do you think it works so well? Well,
as I sort of said early on, though, how can I make this feel something different? And the idea of, if you do like melodramatic's a loaded word, obviously, but big dramatic captions from a third-person narrator, it ends up just feeling like 4. You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's the thing. You know what I mean? And it can't feel like 4. So I sort of, and it's just part of it is, I said earlier about humanizing the character. Some people like pushing the Eternals to be more like humans, and I'm making the Eternals weirder. Yeah. Having a voice that's a lot more human, framing them changes that. You've got this. And the fact the machine's malfunctioning allows you to have a bit of leeway. That was my kind of thing. I thought like this is quirky, and to us, it's always a balancing act of okay, how much do I push it here? And there's definitely a lot of times I go, no, this is too quirky. I'll delete some captions. Mm-hmm. And occasionally, it's really useful if I need to solve a storytelling problem. But there's also times. The fact that the machine isn't almost all the way there, when the machine goes off on one, it can be really funny. But there's other bits, especially I think in the second arc, it gets genuinely chilling. Mm-hmm. Like, because it's one of these, it's like the malfunctioning AI of the machine, like the colloquialisms. When that turns to something else, that's interesting. There's a whole section in the first arc. I've cut because I write a lot more for the machine than I use. Because I kind of like wouldn't say free associate, mm-hmm. but close to that. Like I go, okay, what has the machine got to say about this? And a lot comes out, and then I cut it. And there's a whole section about him watching Mussolini die.
Wow.
And talking and definitely talking about the machine's somewhat ambivalent feelings towards humans, like as in how to, and there's a lot, and I've cut that because it actually was just overwriting the page. It's the sort of thing I might put in later, but that kind of. That was in the context of Thanos. It's worth noting, as in that Thanos dying. It is one of those kinds you feel. It's the counter melody, mm-hmm. And especially it's like especially how it interacts with the data pages. I think that's the other interesting aspect, because occasionally there's bits where you realize, wait, the machine's voice is the data page, mm-hmm. And then you kind of got that bit in issue 7 when Druid calls up a diagram to show Thanos how he's going to gerrymander the election.
I love that. That was so good.
I was so pleased. And then you realise, oh, that's the next data page. Wait. So the data pages are in universe as, you know what I mean? So all of it ties together like that. I know there's, I said earlier, like, stay true to your obsessions. There's a sense of, if it amuses you, there's a chance of it might amuse someone else. And that at least speaks to the audience I've hopefully built of like, I think this is fun. I think you will too. And it's even that kind of, the sort of the Lemony Snicket, which I've not read, but that kind of, that aspect of narrator, is a little sugaring. I mean, irony is a loaded word now, but they kind of, what I'm really interested in is dramatic irony, in terms of like, let's play these two things together and let's look at this in a slightly different way. Because the thing is, what I really like about the Machine is, it absolutely does the job of a classic third-person narrator. You know, Icarus as an arrow is not a Gen Z joke. You know, so it 100% does all the normal stuff that you would expect from a melodramatic narrator, and then it just sort of wanders off because it's got confused.
Yeah. And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. You may have heard of Bad Idea, the experimental comic book publisher that's rolling deep with titles from electric talents like Matt Kint, Mark Russell, Marguerite Sauvage, and more, and doing it with oversized, ad-free, over-the-top releases you can only find at select comic shops around the world. There's no variants, trades, or digital versions either, so if you want one of their big Final 5 releases that are being released throughout the rest of 2021, make sure to visit badideacorp.com to find a comic shop near you, or to pre-order a copy online. Do so soon, because rumors are saying Bad Idea is over, so this might be your last shot. And now, back to the show. You know, it kind of reminds me in some ways, obviously it's a different beast, but it reminds me of like Deep Thought and like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and everything.
Yeah. Hitchhikers is I hadn't thought about Hitchhikers but someone mentioned that to me about issue 4 or so, and it's like, oh no, 100% Hitchhikers an influence there.
Yeah.
You know, because I was even when I was chatting to Clayton about design, I wanted sort of a retro futurism. The idea, you know, that kind of, I often talk about. Have you seen an old school asteroid machine?
No. Wait, you mean like the arcade?
Yeah.
Oh, I've played one. Yeah.
Actually, in the arcade though.
Mm-hmm.
Just checking. This is one of the things. When I was in like Barcade like about a decade ago, I was in like younger friends, music people, so not gamers. And of course, I used to be a games critic. And they said, "Okay, what should we play?" And what I did was essentially a wine tasting evening. So like we got our drinks. Okay, play this first. Notice this, this, and this. Now go here. This is 10 years later. Notice this. What's the missing collection? Allow me to show you. And that was Robotron to Smash TV back to Gauntlet. They were absolutely blown away by the Asteroids cabinet. And obviously I'd seen an Asteroids cabinet, so I wasn't as much, even though I thought it was beautiful. And they said they hadn't seen anything really like it. And of course that reminds you that the Asteroids cabinet uses technology we don't use anymore. It uses a completely different way screens work, with the beam on it and stuff. So it's hyper bright and it's very incredibly clean. It draws in lines, not pixels. And but we just don't use it anymore. And it's kind of and that was the look I want for Eternals. The idea that this is a retro, this is old technology, but also forgotten, but also of the future. The idea that, because the thing about being eternal, it means you're simultaneously of all times and no time simultaneously. You're passing through every single moment, but like no moment is yours. Mm-hmm. And that kind of trying to evoke that was kind of what we were doing there, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it totally works. And the voice, I mean, the machine is really a standout. I like, honestly, after watching The Earth and watching people forever, apparently the ability to be omniscient and see every single person who's ever been funny ever makes the machine extremely good at comedic timing, because there's some incredible like page turn jokes that happen in this book. I absolutely love it.
That's what the joy is. And like you said, it's definitely one of those things, like I leaned into making the book itself. And I said earlier about like finding your audience, that kind of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make bold choices which some people won't like, and I'm fine with that, because I'd rather make a book that, you know, because Eternals has to be a book that appeals to people for its own reasons. Let's give more reasons, as in people to know what Eternal is. In the same way, like, you know, like, I mean, obviously not the same, but like what Matt Aha did with Hawkeye, you know, like redefining what Hawkeye book looks like. You know, that kind of, that a book when you kind of get all of the later books will at least hopefully hark back to that in some way. That was trying to do. I was trying to write an Eternals book that said, okay, this is a new way of doing Eternals that people can do their own spins on, but like, and hopefully is addictive.
That reminds me of something that I kind of talk about a lot, which is that it's interesting. I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. It's like Grant Morrison doing new X-Men. It's going to be Grant Morrison's version of X-Men. It's not going to be like the same flavor of X-Men we get. And it's interesting because sometimes there's this real push-pull when it comes to Marvel and DC stuff where it's like some audiences want that old flavor, but they don't realize that if they got a new flavor, it's going to be the one that they really, really love because it gives them something different. And I think that's one of the fascinating things is like trying to balance recognition of these characters in this world with giving them something new that makes them feel something different. And it's interesting because like you look through every iconic and classic run, Matt and Aha on Hawkeye, you look at like, I mean, even something like Born Again by Frank Miller and Mazzucchelli. It's like, that's a Daredevil story, but it's doing something a little bit different with Daredevil. And it's doing it in such a concise and like in your face manner that there's a reason why it's lived with us forever, and it will live with people forever as long as Marvel is around. I think that there's a lot of value to, I don't know, to put it in music terms, it's like cover bands are a lot of fun, but sometimes you want to hear something new.
Or it's like, there's ways to, and covers can be really, you can be much more interpretive in your covers. Yeah. And the idea absolutely. Even if you're playing in the same genre, you can find new ways to make that genre different. Absolutely. It's definitely, it's one of the joys of work hard when it really works is that a character's been around forever and you go, never thought about that. You know what I mean? And it's that kind of like just a way of, this is what I sort of said earlier about so much about holding on to what makes you unique as a writer, is just how do you see stuff? What interests you? And all you really have is your eyes. And, hopefully you can like develop your eyes in many ways, because that's definitely part of it. I said that whole kind of hoping to create a blueprint for how Eternals go on. I immediately thought of that. I went, no, I'm not. I don't want that. Like the idea of people doing really bad versions of the Machine is like, no, that'd be awful. But at least creating a space where people get an aesthetic of, oh no, Eternals is this kind of mixture of the epic and the human and the quirky and the, I think that's what I meant. Is here's a different way of looking at Eternals. It might be useful to you.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's go in another Marvel direction. So, as I noted at the beginning, Immortal X-Men was announced. It's coming March 30th with you and Lucas Wernick and the aforementioned Mark Brooks providing covers. I guess I could do the entire solicit, but I don't even know if solicits really matter at this point. The point is, it's effectively a Quiet Council book. And actually, I do want to use one line from this semi-solicit, which is, prepare for sinister secrets to be revealed and learn that some secrets are more sinister than others. That's a lot of sinister in the solicit. A lot of sinister. But, I do want to talk about the fact that you're returning to the X-Men. You wrote Uncanny X-Men before, as well as Generation Hope. John Hickman once said on this podcast that you had a standing invitation to get in on the Krakoa business. Why did you decide to get back in the saddle with Immortal X-Men?
Well, John had left. I couldn't give him the satisfaction. Gone. I couldn't give him the satisfaction of being in the room when he was there because I was like, actually, joking aside, maybe it's partially that. It's there is that kind of I think basically there was. So I have to answer this properly. I felt that the Eternals had been so much fun, made me think, yeah, I'm up for doing some more work for hire. Because it's definitely partially that I didn't have, with the last few years, I did not have it in me to do it a bit more create around. Like the idea of actually starting from something from scratch, like Die, was more than my mind could allow myself. So I decided, in a rare example of like being gentle to myself, be gentle to myself. And like, it's one of those jokes, is the idea that the amount of work I put into like Uncanny in terms of the history and the world building and all the X-Men stuff, that's the easy option. That says much more to my damage than anything else. But it was definitely that was part of it. Part of it's I'd heard nothing but wonderful things about the X Office. Mm-hmm. Like I described in my latest newsletter, part symposium, part gang. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of it. It's just a really group of supportive people, and it runs tightly in a way I've never really worked before. I mean, I mentioned earlier, I've used the hermit metaphor repeatedly, but my mode is very much leave me alone. Like I will, I think I'm good at taking notes, and like I definitely had at least several editors say to me that kind of, well, I'm somebody you'll tell the problem to, and then I'll go away and solve it and come back with you. So I don't need much supervision. But working in a place where we're trying to weave something much more complicated together that stretches out X amount of time into the future, no pun intended. That's different and interesting. And I said earlier, like, what haven't I done before? Like, what I did Eternals was like, I haven't taken a Marvel property and entirely refreshed it from scratch. And like, in the case of like Immortal is actually something I definitely haven't done before. It's me coming back to a book. Like, and it's not quite the same. I must admit, the X is a moving target, so it's not quite returning, but it's definitely something I've not really done before. But me working as part of a larger meta narrative in a shared universe, while still being really come in, be aggressive, and make big moves. That's kind of like my document is sizable. I remember pretty much the last thing John said to me is, "Yeah, again, Kieron, you've sort of created like about 5 times as much stuff as you need," and it's true. My process from my synopsis to this is one of my flaws as a writer, which I referenced earlier. There's just too much of it. Like I overcomplicate. I'm aware that is it a Chanel rule? I forget. It's one of the fashion people who's like, before heading out the house, take a last look at your outfit and remove one object. I could do that with plotting. It's like, before sending your synopsis off to an editor, Kieron, remove 5 characters. So it's partially that. I mean, it's like I was invited in as Jonathan was leaving, was the thing. So it's never like I was joining when Jonathan's there. It was like Jonathan's off, and it was like, this is where we'll be. You want to join? And I was like, yes. So at least on some awful level, it was because Jonathan left. Because it's like, this is the Quiet Council book. The Quiet Council book is the heart of the X project in lots of ways.
Yeah.
So if Jonathan was, and that's what I'm interested in writing. But if Jonathan was still here, I think Jonathan would be doing this book.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because it's the Krakoan book. Yeah, sorry. I was thinking that as I said aloud, and I don't want to downplay how the world works as a coherence sort of thing. But this is the high-level Krakoan power book.
Right.
This is about like what is the nation of Krakoan got to do next? What are the problems they're facing? What are the messy solutions they're going to have? What are the compromises that leave no one happy? And fight scenes too. Because I'm not entirely stupid.
It's funny. It's like one of my favorite issues from Jonathan's X-Men run was the Davos issue, like number 4. Yeah. It's a killer. But I mean, at the same time, like that's I'm not saying that like you're going to be having Apocalypse rolling around with a suit on, which, great look. Who knew? But at the same time, that's like the matters of state that I think are really fascinating about Krakoa. And like to a certain degree, I mean, I don't imagine that every issue is going to be the Quiet Council sitting around in 12 chairs. So they'll probably go out doing stuff. But it is interesting. I'm interested in where this came from, because did you get a Quiet Council book pitched to you, or did you get it coming back to the X-Men pitched to you?
Quiet Council.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And to be honest, like it is, I'm sort of unpacking my sort of thinking because I hadn't really thought about it in that way. But like, yeah, this feels weirdly the most. I mean, me and Jonathan are similar writers in some ways, but very different in others. But this feels a very Jonathan-y book. This is the people in boardrooms and they've all got graphs book. Right. Yeah. So it was definitely me pitched doing a Quiet Council book. And to be honest, it's like, would I? Obviously, I've been offered a standing offer in that. Would I be interested in coming back and doing Marauders? Probably not. You know what I mean? Like that kind of like fun X group stuff is something I've done before. You know what I mean? But something that is a bit more political on that scale and like that high level politics stuff, that's something I haven't done before in that focus. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It's finding your distinctive flavor, like the thing that you're looking for that separates from everything else you're doing and have done.
Yeah. It's definitely like but it's like, tell you, it's like I mainly feel like I said this when I was writing the X-Men books first time. People are that was the announcement of the book was exciting in terms of people being really kind about, as in how much they liked my first run. That was like, oh, that's nice. But like, I think one of the reasons why people did like my run was I was knocking over dominoes that had been set up by the previous 10 years of writers. I actually, for like the 2000s work for hire, I think the best piece of collaborative work done in the medium was the Cyclops' emotional journey from the beginning. Where did it start? Whether in 2004 all the way up to AVX, and then then it was a kind of new start in the new direction for the people. That kind of the Breaking Bad of it
Mm-hmm.
worked really well. And I was basically taking over Breaking Bad in season 4.
Mm-hmm.
So I got all this stuff on the table, and I got to be the person who to write that. And I don't take credit. I executed it, but I don't. This is the natural, logical yes and of Work for Hire Comics. And I kind of feel a bit like this. Like, if Immortal's any good, it's because Jonathan set up all the cool stuff in Inferno.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not quite true. Okay, it's partially true because it's definitely where I think obviously a really cool place to do a bloody book, but it's also like a really great place for me to put my ideas in there as well. As in, all right, what about this? Because that's actually the fun of it. I've been reading X's the whole Krakoan era as a reader, so I've been going, what about that then? Or if that kind of if I was Mr. Sinister, I would. I suppose. It's like the internet meme is. If I was Professor X, I would simply. It's a wonderful position because I got to be a reader and then kind of like, sort of take that set, have both to come in with my fresh sort of take on stuff from the outside, but also kind of be able to build so much from what they've all created. Because I don't, obviously John gets a lot of the credit and rightly so, but like there's so much everyone has created.
Yeah,
there's so much like people are custodians because that's kind of like. I don't view Immortal as I view Immortal as a book that everything feeds into. I'm really into it's the political book, therefore whatever's important politically in other books must feed into it. Like even doesn't need to be whole stories, but it must nods at least. You know what I mean? Like whatever is about Krakoa on the world stage has to be echoed in my book. So it's that kind of like, and that's really interesting, almost anarchist commune energy to it. Where all these books are. You said about fractals, not fractal. What's the word you use? Aspects of me.
Yeah.
And all the X books are aspects of what's going on in the X universe, and they all sort of at least come through Immortal in some way.
So it's not like Immortal is necessarily the headliner. It's like the tie that binds. It's the connect. It is kind of like the thing from the fulcrum from which everything else spins.
Oh, that's too. I know you. I know why that's one way. I suspect some people might say that. I don't think that's the right way to look at it, though.
Okay.
It is a useful focus to get the high level of where Krakoa is.
Gotcha.
Like, I wouldn't say like the front pages of the newspaper. That actually diminishes it because it's a bit more. It's more complicated than that. But it's that kind of like it's the book where you'll get questions like, okay, what about this then?
Mm-hmm. I do like the comparison you made in your write-up where you said, I thought this being the new Avengers to Jerry's Avengers over in X-Men. If we're playing off like the Hickman run where it's like Avengers is like the big hero book, so X-Men is like the big hero book, and New Avengers is kind of like the machinations.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And this, you see what I mean? This is when I said I don't think I'd be doing this book if Hickman was here, because I think Hickman will be doing it.
Right.
Like, I agree. That's it. That's true. That it is absolutely the schemy book. It's Machiavellian. I tell you, it's like they're 12 great. The Quiet Council are a great bunch of characters, and they have all such individual voices and takes and views on things. And this is, and I think it's like the scene in season 1 of Possession, just any of the voting scene, any scene where it's a straight vote, it's weirdly exciting.
Oh yeah,
because and I'm not going to just do a book of voting scenes because some voting I just do in a panel, and that you could take. Okay, we take that as given. We skip for other ones. Like, oh no, we're going to go in basically like a John Woo action fight in terms of who's raising their hand. But at the same time, like, this is probably the bigger challenge in the book is it's the smaller meetings. It's when people get together and sidebar. When the deal goes down, and also what they actually do, because they're all incredibly powerful people doing stuff. You know what I mean? They're also like heroes, and look at the means of production. In the case of like Xavier, he's Xavier and Emma to some degree Cerebro. This is literally a fundamental part of the infrastructure of Krakoa. That's all that stuff I'm interested in.
I do think it's interesting because, like, I think the voting thing is fascinating. I'm a baseball fan. Baseball is an interesting sport because, in a lot of ways, it is incredibly boring because it takes forever and it's just yada yada yada. But one thing I think is interesting about it is every time a pitch is thrown, like all attention is on this one action, and that one action is naturally very tense because all the focus is on this one thing. And I think that's what's interesting about the vote. But also it's like you look at a scene like to play off of Inferno, spoilers for Inferno 2, I think, where Mystique is trying to move the vote. And so there's this like sequence where she's like incentivizing other people on the Quiet Council to do things. Like she does the Pulp Fiction briefcase to Emma Frost, where she gets the thing that she really wants. And that's the stuff that's really interesting. Like one thing I think is fascinating about Immortal X-Men is in the name and the very idea. It's like when you talk about like political rival stories, like, you know, for example, an extreme version of this would be Game of Thrones, where a lot of it's political, but a lot of it's based off of, if you don't get what you want through political means, you can always just kill the person. And one of the things I think is interesting about this is that is not an option here. So it's like you can kill them, but they're coming back. And that's not going to help you. And I do think that makes, it's like when death is off the table for this type of story, it changes it fundamentally in a very interesting way.
I agree. Like honestly, like how can you deal with your opponent?
Right.
Because they're sticking around. And like, the other thing about, it's one of these rules of storytelling is that emotional connection is quite often born of understanding what the hell's going on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like that kind of, I know what's at stake, and then we could, in this case, politics is incredibly clean and addictive. I mean, describing those scenes in Inferno, I love them. You know, I mean, I think of all the, I'm not saying that's all our book is people manipulating the Quiet Council, but there's a lot of it.
It's lobbying.
You know? And it's absolutely like, if you enjoyed that issue of Inferno, that's kind of the, you know, the stuff. I'm sorry, so Eternal 7, when I did the gerrymandering issue.
Yeah.
I wrote that and I was thinking, is anyone going to like, I must say, I think I love this. And I kept on joking, but at the same time I was joking to my friends, like, yes, a page of data about gerrymandering an election in the mighty Marvel manner. Yeah, this is what Stan and Jack would have done. But everyone loves it. So, and it's like, no, I said earlier about having faith in something if you think something's interesting, assume that other, you know, probably, hopefully other people will too, if you sell it well enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, I mean, smart, if occasionally awful people acting in smart ways and trying to maneuver around each other, that's really interesting. And it's high. I tell you, talk about Lucas for a second. Lucas makes everyone really glamorous as well.
Oh yeah,
which helps. You know what I mean? It gets a real kind of political. You know, everyone's. I mean, it's the X-Men. Most people are hot, but like everyone has got that real kind of like. The tension is on multiple levels in that way.
I feel like Druig would be a good character for this book.
Druig's sorry, I talk about characters who I Druig. I'm not sure Druig would get on the Quiet Council.
No, probably not.
He's too
naked. He's too naked in his moves and ambition.
He would have to play the long game to get there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so of all the characters, like Druig is like simultaneously one of the most me characters, as you know, slimy Machiavellian bad guy. Like I've read quite a few of them over the years, but like he's some way the worst. He's the most venal, rather. You know, he's got very few redeeming traits. He's apart from possibly being self-aware about them.
Is he like the Woden of Eternals?
Oh, he's like, I think I actually think that he is the closest to Woden. He's worse than Woden in some ways, though. I tell you, my favorite when I was writing him in like issue 7, like I realized, he's a workaholic. You know, that bit when he was talking about everyone else slacking off. Oh no, He works really hard. And that suddenly made him sort of click. And that image of him as being like, you know, at the beginning I was 3 people back, then I was 2 people back. You know, and I know that, you know, I will have to, you know, I will only be ever standing on the shoulder of a great man at best. Of course, you know that's a lie. He doesn't really think that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you know, it's the star scream of him to go to Transformers.
Oh my God. Yes. Starscream. My God. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I do want to ask about another line you had in the press release for Immortal X-Men, which was, it's about a group of people, some of whom are convinced they're in the West Wing, some who have designs to be in House of Cards, and at least one who knows they're in Veep. Is Mr. Sinister the one that knows they're in Veep? Good
question. I must say, I dropped that. That line is a tweaked version of a line in my actual original pitch document about the tonal variety. And it's that kind of like, yeah, you'd think Sinister would be a good bet for that.
Yeah.
Is he? I think it's much more on those kind of like, I think I was, in the original pitch document, I was speaking to the tones the book can go. You know, like, and it's like, politically, it doesn't, it's it's basically three models of what a political thing can be. Political can be about, oh, politics is good. It always does good things. We must try our best. Or politics can be, these people are awful. They're trying to kill each other. Or politics are ludicrous. Everything is dumb.
Yeah.
How do we all survive a day? And that's kind of like, those are three tones of how things get done. I kind of want to hit upon, because that's, I said earlier about Eternals, the different sort of tones. I'm aware that I do not, I'm not sure I don't have it in me. I have little interest in doing a book that's purely stately.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's weird and human stuff as well. We'll see. Actually, I said that. We'll see.
Yeah, I think if any book is like one flavor all the time, you're going to get tired of it, and readers might get tired of it because you're tired of it. And so I think like having those tones is really interesting. I also think that the cast helps a lot. Like I recently talked with Chip Zdarsky about like kind of consensus favorite favorite characters to write at Marvel, one of whom was Emma Frost. So you're starting at a really good point. I'm not saying he's going to appear, but I kind of feel like Namor could 100% show up in this book. But I feel like the Quiet Council is very deep in contenders for this. There's a lot of characters that, especially in this era, feel very fun to play with. And I imagine you agree with that idea.
Oh, yeah. They're an interest, and like, especially some of the ones who've been like underexposed. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like Exodus. Like Exodus is kind of like, he's a major player, but he's not like he hasn't done as much. He's one of the characters I'm most interested in because I've got a strong take on him, shall we say?
Yeah.
I would say a strong take. I mean, you'll go, oh right, people hopefully recognise what I'm doing with him. I'm definitely leading into what I think makes him interesting, because he's a weird character as well. Like his history is like, what? Really?
Yes.
You did that?
Yeah.
I mean, there's one other thing. I mean, can I say? Do you want to say this? I'm moving the. I'm probably. This is one of the advice I'm using. I'm sort of playing with using the different narrator in every issue.
Okay.
So in other words, like that is one way that tone changes. So we're going to get like, it's not a spotlight episode per se. Occasionally it is, but like you get to know people narrating, therefore their secrets and what they think about each other, and also like a strong focus on the issue. To be honest, I say this is like I will abandon this the second it gets in the way of telling the story.
Right.
But like at least for like the first 4 or 5, maybe longer, they're going to be like firmly tied to a character's perspective, and that speaks to what you're saying, as in like these are characters I'm interested enough in writing them as primary narrator for an issue. And I definitely don't want that to be taken as they are the solo character. It's not going to be solo issues tied together, but they are the perspective through which you see the scenes, or the majority of the scenes.
One thing I think, so before we started recording, you mentioned something along the lines of like with Immortal X-Men, anyone can be a hero and anyone can be a villain. And I think that one thing that the narration does is no one's going to, if you're going to be a narrator, you're not going to be the villain of your story. From your perspective, everything you're doing is the right move. And well, maybe. I guess some people are self-aware. But at the same time, I do think that's an interesting wrinkle, because like the narration can color. Like I look at Exodus as a longtime X-Men reader, and I look at Exodus as a villain. But if I read Exodus's narration, I'm going to see his perspective. I'm going to see why he does these things he does. And maybe I don't agree with them, but maybe I understand him a little bit. And that's one of the interesting things I think narration can change, is it fundamentally will change our understanding and appreciation of why they do these things they're doing, which I imagine is going to be a big part of your book.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's definitely also like, yes, very much so. I mean, I think it's a cliche thing for write. I don't write villains. I write people with, strong emotions. But there's that, like I don't like black hatting people do stuff for a reason. And like Wars of Future is an exception. The characters do, the monsters do stuff for story reasons. Those characters are flat and deliberately so, and they're awful, and they're haunted by, they're literally haunted people essentially, because they've been reduced to like story tropes. But like everyone justifies for a reason. Even like being self-aware is a form of justification. Like being self-aware normally is another step where, okay, what are you really hiding there?
Right, exactly.
Like
obfuscating your villainy.
Oh yeah, I can't help it. I'm a bastard. It's a way of it's saying, well, I can't help myself. I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
So it's out of my control. All that's a simple example, but everyone has that. So the whole no heroes and villains in X-Men. it's much more about, like, I mean, everyone's been redeemed, everyone's been gone back into villainy, back and forth. X-Men are a cast of people with powerful takes on things, and I want to try to write everyone's take as honestly as I can and convincingly as I can. Because if even the ones I disagree with, because it's really, I don't, that you can see that when I was writing Cyclops last time, I wanted to take Cyclops, and when he was, the Phoenix Five and he kills Professor Xavier, I was writing him to, he found a way to justify that killing Xavier was the thing that Xavier would have wanted. That kind of, well, Xavier's dream is important. The thing to get the dream is killing Xavier. I'll have to kill Xavier. Oh, it's unfortunate. It's very upsetting. I don't want to do it, but I'm going to have to because it's the right thing to do. You know what I mean? And okay, that's I wouldn't say a basic example. That's a very clean example. But I was definitely aware when I was writing Avengers versus X-Men tie-ins, I was writing why the X-Men believe they're right. And there was I had early data page that Cyclops sent a press release at the end of issue, like one of the early issues in AVX, explaining, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I'm making an argument. This is what the X-Men would say to justify themselves.
Such a Cyclops move to do. He's totally a press release guy.
It is. It's like, if you're like, gets his PowerPoint out, and actually, no, Beast is the PowerPoint guy. Actually, I'm not going to say that.
Okay. I do want to talk about a random thing I noticed, and this might be like going way too down the rabbit hole. So, Immortal X-Men isn't a secret, but the Quiet Council is basically, like, to a degree, the mutant Illuminati. Eternals are quietly the ones who basically control the Earth, or at least are in charge of the thing that is the Earth. Once and Future has Bridget, Duncan, and Rose, who are for the most part operating on a side of the world no one realizes exists, and like basically protects people without them knowing it. And then everyone from Die effectively created an entire world no one knows exists and might actually ruin the real world, and et cetera, et cetera. Are you on a low-key undercover bosses kick?
I don't know. It's like I found myself thinking about the if you go back, like, the anarchist and communist theory and the idea of a vanguard who will change society, and I hope I'm not that, because I frankly disagree with that politics. I kind of just worry how much is the gamer coming out. Mm-hmm. Someone who's played a lot of games and like who is interested in the clean decisions of board games. Mm-hmm. That kind of like, okay, that we set up the rules and this is what happens. And because games are really modeling, it's this like modern idea of board games and video games. Comes from the statistical science of the 19th century. The idea that we can model the world to some degree and create a simulation of it. Mm-hmm. So at least part of what my thinking, I think, may just come from that kind of stuff. The idea that these are people playing games.
Right.
And it's weird because, like, as a human being, I'm not that kind of person. I'm aware the older I get, the more lawful good I get, to go D&D for a second. Like, I dislike it because I don't think lawful good is right. Yeah. But on an emotional level, as I tell the truth all the time. Yeah. I'm not very good at lying. Duncan is much more like me than, Emma Frost is. I would much rather be Emma Frost. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, it is something that you get that thing. It's like there must be something in that sort of shit that appeals to you, and you've just hung again, haven't you?
Yeah. I will say I'm also probably lawful good. I think I've been lawful good my entire life. Like when I was a kid, parents always complimented how I dressed because I dressed like an accountant basically for my entire life, which is bizarre. I don't know. I mean, that's one of the things I think is interesting about looking at your career. I'm not saying that you've fundamentally changed since in these ways that you're a completely different writer than you were when you started doing like phonogram and stuff like that. Mm. But I feel like in your current stuff, I can see a lot of evolution in you. And I don't know, I know this is a really hard question to answer because it's just like, I don't know, I guess it's maybe a self-awareness thing too, but it's just like, do you feel like you can feel how your interests as a writer have evolved over the years? Like, is that something you're cognizant of, or is it just like you're always in it and so it just is what it is, if that makes sense?
It's tricky. I am somebody... There's a fundamental conflict in my work, I think, between somebody who is deeply cynical about the power of how stories manipulate people, how the art we love can be used to hurt us, how it separates from people we love, how, all those kind of aspects, and somebody who is clearly utterly in love with it. Mm-hmm. That's the thing about Phonogram. It's an incredibly down-key book about music, but which is clearly written from a point of obsession. And those two things being true always for me is where it's about, as in I'm in how the things I love bad for me. And I can sort of see and how stories control people and how can we be better? How much is what are the stories we tell about ourselves and all those kind of things. Because all my stories like always start characters in a bad place and emotionally flawed, generally end up happier than I think people expect. People, I think, are going to realise that Journey to Mystery was an exception. Most of my stories are happy stories.
Yeah.
Or rather, actually, I'm lying. Most of the stories are bittersweet stories because I'm depressive enough to believe that, you know, death stalks everything. Mm-hmm. But bittersweet is acceptable. Yeah, I'm aware of how I've changed a bit. I think Wictive was a book that changed my life. It was deliberately designed to sort of set fire to parts of me as a younger person. And I came out the side. I don't know. It's tricky. I feel more at peace now than I perhaps did then.
Mm-hmm.
I think definitely before Wictive, I feel I had a lot to prove. I was more brittle as a person. I mean, like, I think that Wictive explicitly was an aim of I want to write a signature comic by the time I'm 40. Mm-hmm. Like, not Phonogram, something big and undeniable. And, you know, the ego in there. And, you know, I'm also at home with the ego. Like, ego is a thing. But like that, and I did it, and it doesn't change anything. You know, it does change. I mean, it changes emotionally, but like you kind of know the hole is bottomless, and therefore fuck the hole.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of hope that what might be more visible in my work, how it changed, is more hopefully a calmness. I mean, I said I'm still a hyperactive storyteller in lots of ways. I think I overcomplicate things, but there is a calmness. I don't need to impress you as much, and even when I'm doing something really wanky like the Peter Cannon. You know, Peter Cannon is deliberately, I'm going to show off now. But it's not showing off in a way that I care about you liking or not.
I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but as soon as you said wanky, I figured you're going to talk about Peter Cannon. And that seems really rude that I said that. But, you know, the calmness, I see that. Like it's like a calmness and a confidence in, like, it's like you got through Wictive, you got that magnum opus out of the way. But now it's like you know what you want as a storyteller. And I do think like the stories that we tell, I think the one thing I really like about your work too is you look at like Once and Future. It's not just about like Arthurian legend or Beowulf or anything like that. It's about like the stories we tell as like families. What Bridget, like Gran, tells Duncan. And if you really look at it, she is the biggest monster in the entire story in some ways. And like she deliberately ruined her family's life in dedication to something that no one knows about. And it's such an dark and somehow credit to you, credit to Dan, credit to Tamara, credit to everyone. Gran still is an absolutely incredible character that we can't help but love. But like the last issue literally ends with her daughter aiming a gun to like basically kill them. And you're just like, this is completely understandable. But I think that's one of the things that's interesting too, is like, you talk about stories and the impact on everything. And it's like, it's not just the stories that we read, it's the stories we tell each other.
I think that's it's one of those things that when I say that, I'm aware that people generally are thinking about, oh, he's talking about, you know, D&D or whatever. No, I'm not. I'm talking about, am I a good person?
Right.
I'm talking about those stories as in, what is a good person? I mean, like last time I was in the X office, I did the story of Colossus, which is based about him falling into the idea of self. He had to sacrifice himself. And that's what heroism means, which is, let's be honest, it's my Catholicism coming out. You know, I was raised Catholic. But that's the story, you know, and all the way through, like occasionally, like in Wictive, I turn into a metaphor, like the idea of godhood being a story. But mostly, I'm interested in how do we present ourselves to each other? How do we get through the day? I mean, I know with Once and Future, it's very easy to talk about the showy stuff. But you're right, for me, it's absolutely anytime I just become the showy stuff, I think, okay, let's get back to the family drama. Let's the whole issue that follows is, you know, Bridget and Bridget and Mary at gunpoint, and, you know, and that we did that before in like when Mary came out with Rose and told her story. You know, basically when we want to slow down, we get, you know, we make people draw guns at each other and then have a heart to heart. I mean, I tell you, one of my favorite things I did in my series, when the far right guy is dying and Bridget's talking to him, and he's dying in the pub, and it's like, there's something, you know, it's sort of, let's ground this, let's make this human. let's have a conversation about like what life even is. And Bridget kind of lays it out and how she thinks about, and it's about, the book is rarely more explicitly about nationalism and how nationalism can be a poison and what it can do to people. And I love doing that, you know, that kind of like, just, I know I'm like such an idea based writer quite regularly, but the character stuff is very much the heart of it. Like, I always tell that I'm onto something, because if I think of an idea and it upsets me, I know it's probably right. You know what I mean? Like, people regularly say they cry over my books, like different sort ones, and it's like, well, the thing I always tell them is like, oh no, I'm the first. If you've cried over it, I guarantee it's the first thing. I'm the first person who cried over it, because it's that kind of like, oh, that idea is really upsetting. I'm going to have to do it.
Yeah.
But I think it's like crying over something happy is also powerful too. This is why I try to head towards bittersweet. The idea of like, that is true and awful and wonderful, and that kind of. I said earlier that irony's got a bad rap now, and it has, and rightly so, because irony is taken as not wanting to get involved. But there's many sorts of irony. I think irony is the only way to appreciate the world, because things can be terrible and wonderful at the same time, and regularly are, because that's life has the irony of the kind of is incredibly precious and futile and small, and people can be terrible and amaze you, and often in the same moment. And that's one reason why I quite like writing larger casts, because it allows me to like show how two things can be true at once. Like this, yes, love redeems, but love can also curse you, you know. And those kind of like, they go different ways. And by showing all these people in contrast with each other, you get a truer sense of like how I think the world is, because one story is always removing all other stories. And scene.
That, Kieron, that is the perfect place in this. I really enjoyed your perspective on everything you're doing, from Once and Future to Eternals and the upcoming Immortal X-Men. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Actually, before I go, one last thought, the Uncle Ben thing. I think the best way for me to sum up the kind of the Uncle Ben of everything is that people say, what is Spider-Man's origin? And people who don't really get Spider-Man say Spider-Man's origin, he was bit by a radioactive spider. No, Spider-Man's origin is when Uncle Ben got killed. Yes, you know what I mean? Getting his powers didn't make Spider-Man. You know, and that's for me the truth of Marvel characters. And seen again.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Kieron Gillen. You can find him on Twitter at Kieron Gillen, and his work in Eternals, Once and Future, and the upcoming Immortal X-Men. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content, and as members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Nicholas Palmieri, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submit Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiampeng, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Ken Estlin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ranwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinnell, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Debenakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Center in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.